Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you are not too tired after these 2 days of presentation. So thank you for inviting me. I'm Djamel Mostefa. I represent Sistran, a 50-year-old startup company in machine translation. One of my missions at Sistran is to manage the data collection effort, and this is probably why I was invited to present our data management process from an industrial point of view. As an introduction, I would say that in our field, natural language processing and machine translation, we used to say that there is no data like more data, which means that the more data you use for training the system, the better the performance is. I would like to amend this sentence by saying there is no data like more in-domain quality data, which means that you really have to stick to your domain and you really have to choose or to use high-quality data for training your system. And this is particularly true with neural machine translation, as it was highlighted this morning with the WIPO patent office case by Kenneth, I guess. So, you know that everybody is using deep learning techniques, neural machine translation, and we are all using the same approaches and algorithm, and what really makes the difference is the data. So it's really important to manage the data properly and efficiently if you want to have a clear added value to your system compared to other competitors. So here is the outline of my talk. I will start by with a few words about the last achievements at Sistran. For last couple of years. I will describe our corpus management workflow that you can probably use for your needs. I will then talk about the legal aspects and anonymization for sharing the data, which is something that is important. And I will talk about sustainability with storage and sharing the data. So Sistran has been developing machine translation solution for more than 50 years now. We started with rule-based machine translation, then statistical machine translation, and hybrid machine translation, which combines both statistical and rule-based system. And for the last couple of years, we have moved to neural machine translation, for which there is a huge improvement in the quality of the translation. So we cover more than 140 direct language pairs, most of the European languages, some African and Asian languages, and we of course develop machine translation solution for all European languages, but also low resource languages like Pashto, Tajik, Urdu, or other languages. Well, we started in 2016 developing our first neural machine translation, and we were impressed by the quality of the system. I will not give you blue scores or telling you that we have a +1 improvement, and you know that we don't really know what it means at the end. But I will just give you 2 sentences that are written in French for those who can read French. The first one is translated with our statistical machine translation system, and the second one is translated by our neural machine translation. So as you can see, the first sentence, il y a encore un demi-siècle, on effectuait des expériences sur les plantes. has been translated by our statistical machine translation system by yet half a century ago. It was conducting experiments on plants. So you understand what it means, but it's not very fluent. And the neural machine translation translated it in a half century ago. Experiments were carried out on plants, which I'm not a professional translator, but for me, there is nothing to change to the output. For the second example, nos portes sont toujours ouvertes à ceux qui veulent ou auraient envie de nous rejoindre. As you can see, the statistical machine translation is more a word-to-word translation, so the output is our doors are always open to those who want or would want to join. And I think who want or would want to join is not very fluent in English. And the NMT output is our doors are always open to those who want to join us. And again, I think there is nothing to change in the output. Last thing I want to say, and then I will concentrate my talk about Corpus Management, is that I would like to outline that Systron and Harvard University in the US has developed an open source neural machine translation framework publicly available called OpenNMT. And what's the rationale behind this idea? Systron is a private company, and we develop open source software that can be used publicly and freely. So the rationale between this initiative is that we think at Systron that in addition to sharing language resources, we think that it's also important to share tools and expertise on neural machine translation, and this will improve the quality of the machine translation in general. So, corpus management. What is a corpus of a language resource? It can be defined as a set of language data in one or several languages with eventually some annotations. What kind of language resources are we interested in for machine translation? Of course, Parallelcorpora, translation memories, terminologies, lexicons, monolingual corpora. But I would say that this is not an exhaustive list, and you might have seen that recently Facebook published a paper on which they have developed machine translation with only monolingual data and without any parallel sentence. So I would say that any language resource that you can share, just share it, but because we don't know if it will be useful in a couple of years or in 5 years from now. So share the data as possible, even if it's not useless, or even if it's useless for machine translation at the time being. So we usually distinguish training corpora, which are used to train a system, and evaluation corpora, that is used to evaluate or to assess the quality of a system. Usually training corpora are of a bigger size than evaluation corpora, usually 1 million sentences are used to train a good model. It can be less, of course. And for evaluation corpora, the size is really smaller, so you can have evaluation corpora of about 10,000 words, and so only to evaluate the quality of your system. So here is a specific corpus management workflow. The first thing is, of course, to specify the data that you need. You have to think about different aspects, like the type of the data. Are you looking for speech and audio data, text, parallel text, monolingual, lexicons? You have to think also about the languages. Which languages would you like to cover? The domains, of course, the epoch. If you want to build a name entity recognition on all newspaper, you will have to get some annotated name entity on old data, and you cannot use current data to do that. But you also have to think about the size of the data. What is the amount of data I need to develop my system or to evaluate it? But you also have to consider non-technical details like copyright restrictions, time, and of course, cost constraints. That is something that you have to consider. Once you have specified your needs, you have two options. So either you are able to identify an existing corpora that you can use for your project or for your needs. This is the best option. Or if you don't find any corpora that meets your specification, you have to collect it and to produce your own corpora. And in both cases, you need to validate and to assess the quality of the data, because even if you are using existing corpora, you can have corpora of very different level of quality, and this is really important that you assess the quality before you try to train your model. So the specification, it depends, of course, on your project, but there is a core set of information that should be present. The type of the data, as I mentioned, speech, text, multimodal, it can be gesture if you want to develop a sign language machine translation. It can be, you have to define the languages. There are more than 7,000 languages without all the dialects. You have to specify the domains. Of course, if you want to do machine translation in the medical domain, it's not the same as doing machine translation in the financial domain. So this is really something that is important. As I said, the best option is always to find and use existing corpora, and this is what we are trying to do at Sistron. If we cannot find useful corpora for our project, of course, we need to produce and to collect it. And you have two options. Either you produce it internally, or you try to subcontract and use another company to collect the data. There are different way of acquisition of existing corpora. So there is a lot of corpora that is published by the European Commission, by public administration, by the research academy. Usually it's accompanied with very permissive licensing scheme, meaning that you can use it for almost commercial purposes or whatever you need. Then you can get data from or language resources from data centers like the Linguistic Data Consortium in the US, the European Language Resource Association in Europe, or TAOS or other organization. Usually you have different type of license agreements for research, for commercial use, for evaluation, and usually you have to pay for this kind of corpora. And then at Sistron, we have a lot of corpora that are coming from our customers, because usually the business case that we have is that we have some customers who already have a lot of parallel data translated by by professional translators, and they want to improve the process, and so they are coming with us saying, okay, we have all of this bunch of parallel data, can you train a specific model? And this is usually what we do, but unfortunately it cannot be shared, and unfortunately it's used only for the project of the customers, and it can not be used for other purposes. So if you consider the production of corpora, as I said, you can do it internally or externally. There are some pros and cons for these two kinds of production. So if you do it internally, of course, it's less expensive, it's usually faster, but you need to process your data internally. You need to check the quality. You have to deal with the IPR and legal aspects, which is really a pain in the neck. And also, you cannot cover all the languages because you will have a limited linguistic coverage internally. If you decide to go for external production, so it's more expensive and usually it takes more time to get the data. But on the other way, the data that is delivered is usually ready to use, so you don't have to process it anymore. It's usually of good quality. Of course, it depends on the subcontractor that you choose, but usually it's of good quality, and the legal aspects have already been negotiated, so you don't have to deal with all this legal restriction. And there is a wide language coverage, so if you are looking for Pashto to French, you will probably subcontract a company or university in Afghanistan. If you are looking for Kanuri, you will go to Nigeria, etc. So there is a wide language coverage, and it's quite easy to develop Parallelcorpora for different languages. So, of course, the most interesting language resources for machine translation is Parallelcorpora, and this is a typical workflow of how you produce Parallelcorpora. So first you have to find relevant source of information, and this can be done by keyword searching or focus crawler to identify relevant multilingual websites. Then of course you need to crawl the data, align the documents, extract the relevant information, clean the data, segment it, and align the segments. Well, this works pretty well, and you can produce parallel data quite easily and mostly automatically for popular languages like French, English, Spanish, etc. But when it comes to low-resource languages, this is more complicated. Because it will be very difficult to find, let's say, Irish to Kanuri parallel data. I don't think there is any website that publish any news on Pashto and on Kanuri, for example. So you have to consider other options, and the other options would be to produce your own data using bilingual translators. So legal aspects, as I said, it's a pain in the neck, but you have to deal with it. So IPR issues are always difficult to deal with it, especially if you're researchers or engineers. There are dozens of different licenses, but I don't want to describe, from very permissive licenses like copyleft, LGPL, and so on, to very specific licenses. So you have some people that publish some data and have their own license agreement. So you have to read 20 pages to understand what can be done. If you have ever tried to use Facebook, for instance, they are changing their licenses very oftenly, and so you have to check whether it can be used for research, for evaluation, and this is really something that prevents us to move forward. And of course, you have to deal with the different regulations in different countries. For instance, in the US, there is this fair use doctrine for which people are free to use any corpora, even copyrighted data, as long as it is for research. And as far as I know, this is not the same in Europe. So you have to first ask for permission to use the corpora, to use it, even if it's for research. And this is typically the things that you need to think about is, will it be used for research only, for commercial use, for evaluation? Will you redistribute the data or not? And will you make new language resources from the language resource? And so you have to apply different licenses schemes for that. The profile of users is also important. Do you allow only public research lab to use the data, or private company that are doing research, like CStrong? We are doing a lot of research. Or to use it for commercial purposes. So when we talk about sharing the data, of course, the main issue is the anonymization. So I just show you a sample of data that can be anonymized with our tools. So this is how we are doing. We are doing, of course, name entity recognition. So we will recognize all the person names in the text. And then we just replace all the names with some anonymization like XXX, and you can see that it can be done automatically quite easily. So I think the question of anonymization is no more a drawback to share your data. If you want to share the data, it's quite easy to anonymize it. And of course, you can choose the level of anonymization. Do you want to choose only person names, or also organization, also times and dates, etc. So storage and sharing has to be considered seriously if you want your language resources to be sustainable. What do I mean by sustainable? I mean that your data needs to be available over the time with no or little effort to make it available over the time. And we have seen so many data produced and not sustainable that has been not used in other projects. And I remember a lot of projects on which I participated, and the output was that the data was only used within the project. And this is really a pity, so you should really think about sustainability when you're producing or using data. So, to this objective, I would recommend to package your data according to existing standards. So there has been a lot of work and a lot of European project about standardization, normalization of the data in the 90s, etc. So at least I would recommend that you always include a documentation. So I have seen many corpora with no documentation. So you don't know how it has been produced. You don't know if it has been done automatically, if there is a validation procedure that has been done. So at least include the documentation saying if you didn't apply any validation procedure, just say it. There is no validation, everything has been done automatically. We have crawled the web and aligned with some open source software like Unalign or whatever, but just say it so we can know that how it has been produced. You should also put some metadata information, and this is important. The corpus name, the type of the data, the languages that has been covered, the size, the dates, the source, the domain, the license that is combined with this kind of data, the version, etc. Of course, include the data itself and the annotation. If you have done some validation or quality assurance, please add the report about that so we know that it has been already validated and we know that the data is of good quality and we don't have to do any validation anymore. A list of relevant publications. So if the data has been used to develop a wonderful system, it's always good to know that it has been used for that, and so then we can compare with what has been done. Of course, you have to store the language resources in a secure platform with redundancy mechanism. And this is what we are doing at Systran. So at Systran, we have 3 different servers in 3 different countries. So we are sure that if there is a failure in one server, we are not losing 50 years of data collection. You can, or you have to share the data. Systran is not in a good position to talk about that, but at Systran, we share the data internally. So we have offices in the US, we have offices in South Korea, and we share the data internally. We have what we call, we have a catalog which is called Corpus Index, in which there is all the description of all the data that has been collected for decades now. And so it's quite easily to find the data that is relevant to your project. So if you're looking for Korean to Japanese, for instance, for a financial domain, it's quite easily to find all the data that we have and to train your system. If you can, and this is something that I support, is to share your data externally through data catalogs like ELRA or LDC or ELRC. I know that ELRC now is sharing some language resources. This is also something that is beneficial for everybody, because sharing the data means that people are using the data and so assess the quality and can improve the data. So this is something that is really useful. As I said, unfortunately at Systran we cannot do that because basically the data that we are developing has been done for specific customers, and so we do have a lot of restriction on that, but maybe we can find some ways to share some data, but we are sharing some data from public national project or European project. So in conclusion, I would say use existing standards and classification for producing or sharing the data. Describe the data with documentation and metadata. This is really something that is important. As possible, check the quality of the data through well-known validation procedure. Try to deal with the legal issues, even if I know that this is something that is really complicated. And I'm happy that there is now the ELRC help desk that can support you to help you to share the data and to explain you what you can do with the data according to the different license schemes. As I said, if possible, or as much as possible, share the data publicly. We at Systran are sharing the software and expertise through OpenNMT, and I hope that we will be able to share also some data and communicate and disseminate as much as possible the information about the language resources that you have produced or used. And there are some specific communication channels at ELRC. That's it for today, and I thank you for your attention.
Try to speak up. So thank you for the presentation.
Welcome.
I was wondering, in the commercial space, are customers sometimes willing to share data that is compatible to each obtain better results from the machine translation? Does that happen at all? Or is this, except from, I don't know, TAUS or other organizations, like unheard of?
Yeah, good question. So far, I haven't seen a customer that is willing to share the data. And one of the reasons, and I think someone talked about it, is that even if the data has no confidentiality value, the first reflex is to say, no, we will not share the data. So, but we always try to convince our customers to share the data and say that even because if we can merge different databases, we will improve the system. But no, they prefer to pay an extra price and not to share the data to that solution. But we are still pushing for that. But this is the situation right now. But I have to mention that most of our customers are big companies. So I guess that they don't really care about saving 10% of a price, but they prefer, like Adobe, we are doing machine translation for Adobe for several years, and they have a huge database, and they don't want to share the data because they say that it's too complicated, and they prefer to pay a higher price, and so we develop a specific model for them with only their data, and this is how it works until now, but yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. I just want to add some comment on that.
No, that's okay, that's okay.
Just to emphasize that we are really in the best scenario here with the public sector bodies. Because in the industry, just imagine that we are two car manufacturers. I am Mercedes and Joseph is Renault. And we share our data, which means that machine translation, if the data is translation memories, from time to time it will pick up a sentence that is typically what you find in Renault manuals. And of course, Mercedes doesn't want the Mercedes manuals to sound like Renault. That's what we hear from the industry. When they want to train machine translation, they want this really to be trained on their jargon. They don't want the machine translation to be trained on the competitor jargons, because then their manuals will sound either similar or even worse, like the others. So this is a kind of criticism or comment that we hear from industry. But for the basic things, for the this maybe baseline machine translation, I think combining data from different providers, even from industry, would save a lot, but they don't want to do it.
Yeah, thank you very much for this comment. I think in some cases it's also a bit worrying not to lose maybe a competitive advantage or not. And of course the private companies and the private sector, they don't underlie the public sector information directive. So it's a very, very different framework, also a very different framework for data sharing. Nonetheless, as I will show in my next presentation, the private sector and even private sector companies, they do share data in industry, in enterprises, but I think that's, well, part of the next talk.